Welcome on the GospelSpice Podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. GospelSpice is your Christ-centered podcast infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Roussel, and here is today's episode. So in light of everything you've been telling us about enemies and allies, what would you tell our audience, primarily comprised of Western Christians today, and they are seeking to understand our world and to honor God through their understanding of the world we're living in today? So what advice would you give them today?
Well, that's a broad question. Let me try to give it a specific answer, and then you can, there are multiple answers to that question. But one area that I think too few Christians look at the scriptures from the angle of Bible prophecy. We like Bible prophecy when it's already fulfilled, because we say, okay, good, the Messiah came, here's all the evidences of who the Messiah would be. Sure enough, Jesus is that. That's good. We like prophecies related to the second coming, and that eventually all things will be made right. There is going to be a king. There's not going to be elections. There's not going to be, political campaigns and television ads and fundraisers. He's coming. One guy. I mean, not one guy. But the man God, the one true God, is going to reign over the planet for 1,000 years, and that's going to be good. We like the prophecies that he wipes away every tear, and he will bring justice, and he will show mercy, but that will be it. There won't be people gaming the system and taking advantage and harming and the cruelty and the evil that we see in this world. That being said, in between that, many pastors, many Christian leaders, many lay people avoid Bible prophecy because it's complicated, or it's controversial, or it doesn't seem to lead where an individual person or pastor wants it to lead. And that's a problem. 27% of the Bible is prophecy. 27%, 1 out of 4 verses. Now, again, so many pastors, so many ministry leaders, so many churches just avoid it. So if you're avoiding more than a quarter of the Bible, it's a problem, because all scripture is God breathed. It's all inspired by God, and it's profitable. So I ask people, listen, if you have a daughter or a son and you teach them 27% less of what they need to know to drive a car safely, are you helping them or harming them? And what about the other people on the road? If you run a medical school and you teach your medical students 27% less of what they need to know to save a life, who are you helping? You can't just skip stuff because it's difficult or controversial, or leads in a direction that you wish it didn't. And so I would just say that's one of the areas that I get excited when I see the prophecies that have been fulfilled. This gives me confidence that the God who knows the beginning from the end, who is the Alpha and Omega, that he's giving us advance warning of things we should know about. And it's helpful for us. We may not like it. It may be bad things that are coming, but at least we know that he's in charge. And I think that's helpful. And I think a lot of Christians are missing the hope that comes from knowing that he knows in advance what's coming.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very comforting also when we study prophecy to see out of those 27%, all the ones that have already come to pass, relating to Jesus, to so many other topics. And therefore, I don't have the data, but I think it's a little less than half the 27%. I think it's 11% that has not yet come to pass. I might be wrong on that number. And 100% of the prophecy that has not yet come to pass relates to the end times. And that's right. Absolutely fascinating. And again, like you said, if the scriptures have 100% success track record on past of prophecies that have already come true, then it gives us a good indication that the rest is also going to come true.
And one of the spicy things I would say about the Bible, the New Testament in particular, is that there are 8 times more predictions or prophecies about the second coming of Christ than the first. That's interesting, right? And so if we know that one happened, and then we have 8 times more indicators that the second one, so that's encouraging. But one of the areas, just to be specific, is the rebirth of the state of Israel, the regathering of Jews who we've been in exile for 2,000 years or so, coming back to the land. So for some believers, this is very exciting to see it coming to pass in our lifetime. In fact, I would argue that the actual current state of Israel, even with its imperfections and flaws and sinfulness, the fact that it exists and that Jews still exist after all, so many people have tried to wipe us out over the history, is a testimony to atheists and agnostics. God is real and the Bible is true. Now, you may not like all that you read, but what other book has told us that Israel will be reborn as a sovereign geopolitical nation state in someday in the future in history, and Jews will come back and make it a strong and prosperous country? Nobody believed that. Even our church fathers, most of them, Augustine didn't believe it, Luther didn't believe it. So they were good on some things that they totally didn't get this. But that's encouraging as one of the great apologetics in this day and age when people are like, you can't prove God. Well, okay, but prophecy fulfilled in our lifetime is very, very interesting. But if you're from the Arab or Persian or Muslim world and you're like, we don't like Israel. So if you're a Christian in those cultures, it's much more problematic to say, see, that's a good thing because it's caused harm or hurt or your friends and community hate what's happened. So that it's difficult. It's difficult to say, yes, wonderful. I'm so happy that God is moving this way.
Yes, especially when it is that merging of politics and faith. That's very, politics are not being seen the same way by Arabs and Muslims as as far as the state of Israel goes, obviously, as maybe the majority of Western Christians are. So that's fascinating. So you are famous for having books that become reality. I think that's how you became really famous in 2002, I believe. Was it The Last Jihad? I think initially, I might be wrong.
Right, yeah.
Because you kept writing things that would come to pass. 9/11, you wrote about it a year or so before it happened. And, other examples of that you can give us. So, and you always say that you base your books on your study of biblical prophecy. And that is how you can guess to some extent what's happening in the world. So how do you study Bible prophecy? Give us a few tips.
So let me clarify a few things there, Stephanie, because and the trajectory of what you said is right, but there are a few things I want to clarify. So I wrote a novel called The Last Jihad. That was my first political thriller. I began writing that in January of 2001. And the first page puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. That was almost 9 months before September 11th happened. Now, there are differences. It's not a commercial plane, it's a business jet. The target is not New York or Washington, it's Denver, Colorado. So I wasn't trying to predict. I certainly wasn't trying to prophesy.
Right.
And there's nothing about that in Bible prophecy. I was writing a political thriller, but I did believe, based on my studies of the Middle East and my understanding of Bible prophecy, that I believed that evil was going to hit the United States at some point, and this might be a way. But what's interesting about that novel, too, of course, Stephanie, as you know, is that the opener of the kamikaze attack on the United States leads the fictional American president to launch a war against all these radical Islamist terrorist cells and bases. But then he decides to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. That's when things got a little crazy, right? Because people are like, whoa. When the book released, they're like, wait a minute. I mean, it's one thing to write an opener of a kamikaze attack by radical Muslim Islamist, jihadists. That's never happened. And you wrote about it before it happened. But now we're 5 or 6 months out from a decision the president of the United States is actually going to make. Are we going to war to remove Saddam Hussein from power? And you wrote a book about the connection. Like, that's weird. Now, again, none of that is in prophecy. So I don't want to leave people with the impression that I'm Nostradamus, as some in the media have said, or that I'm a psychic, or that I have some secret formula. Well, if you read it this way, and if you add up these numbers and this line, it's going to get. No, I'm not doing any of that.
Yes.
Most of it is geopolitical analysis and projection. What could happen if, and maybe because I have a lot of experience in the region, maybe I'm more right than I wish I was. But it's not prophecy and it's not predictive. It's writing about worst case scenarios. Now, it's true. I will say that some of my novels have been based on the theory of what if this prophecy in the Bible does take place in our lifetime? What might it look like? And one of those, for example, would be the Ezekiel option. There's a very famous prophecy about Russia and Iran and a group of countries coming against Israel in the last days. And the Last Jihad sort of helped set the stage for it. But it's the third book into the series where you really see this Ezekiel prophecy coming to pass. And again, I don't know that it will happen in my lifetime, but people found that fascinating to read a Tom Clancy-esque, Vince Flynn-esque political thriller, an international political thriller, but that's premise was on what if a Bible prophecy that most of us have never even heard of, what if that came true? It was almost an evangelical Da Vinci Code, if I can use that. It was very different from that, but like, we never heard of these things. Is that a thing? Like, does the Bible really say that? And that was fun because you could hook people with a fascinating story, but even for Christians, many Christians have never heard of, or read Ezekiel 38 or 39. Yeah, the war of Gog and Magog. So not just unbelievers or skeptics or atheists like you once were, but people who say, yeah, I love the Lord and I love the scriptures, but I never really thought about that or heard about that. So that was fun too, to talk about those issues.
I would say that's got to be one of the best parts of everything you write, is to draw people to check scripture for themselves to see if it actually does say what you're writing in your books. And if it does that, that's beautiful. I think as believers, we want to encourage people to go to the source and study for themselves what you write about. Well,
it's true, but it's also true that I also get mocked for it, and that's understandable. Peter tells us in one of his epistles that there'll be plenty of mockers about the last days. But as an example, I wrote a novel called Damascus Countdown. Again, a geopolitical thriller, but the underlying basis was Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49, where the city of Damascus, the capital of Syria, the Bible indicates will cease to be a city in the last days of history. We don't know exactly how, we don't know exactly when. How might that happen? Like that, Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the face of the planet. So obviously that prophecy has never happened before. And if it's a real thing, which I believe it is, well, how might that play out? And so I wrote this novel. And then Stephen Colbert, who's now the host of CBS's The Late Show, I took over for David Letterman, but before he had a different show. And he heard about this book and he held it up on the show and he mocked it and ridiculed it, and actually was kind of funny.
That was good advertisement.
It was a good advertisement, I guess. But look, there's obviously there's a lot of people that this stuff is just so ridiculous. But Stephen Colbert was reading it and thinking about it and getting other people to think about it. So I don't consider that a loss. I consider that a gain.
And as you said, it was very hard for people to believe that Israel would become a nation again. So, there's been more impossible things that have come to pass. It's actually interesting. I remember studying that, unless I'm mistaken, Israel is the only nation that has ever been reborn out of a people group that had been scattered all over the world. From what I had seen, all of the people groups that have been scattered in the past never came back together to become a nation again. They just scattered and were assimilated into the cultures. And when you were telling us earlier how the Jews are coming back from all over the world, I found it fascinating to imagine Tel Aviv or Jerusalem being both Bangkok and Paris and Rio de Janeiro and Washington, D.C. all wrapped up into one. That is absolutely a unique event. And so, yes, it definitely confirms that if God could make that happen, as he had said he would, then a lot of the other things can happen.
Right. And it's not just the country of Israel that was resurrected in a sense, or the Jews being resurrected as a people and brought back, to the land. Those are huge, stunning. How did that happen? But the language of Hebrew was effectively a dead language. Nobody used it on a day-to-day basis. And for it to be resurrected as a modern language, my boys are fluent. I'm not. I struggle with it, but I do love it. And it's the language of the Bible. And so it's intriguing that these things that seem dead and buried came to pass, just as the Bible prophesied. It didn't. The Bible doesn't predict things. It's not guessing. It's not like, I think this could happen. No, God knows the beginning from the end. He's the only one who does. And it's one of his proofs of his power, of his omniscience, of his sovereignty. And it makes the Bible spicy. It makes, and when you take the richness of the glory of God, and that he's not us, we're not him. His ways are higher, his thoughts are higher, and he's dazzling us. In Jesus's time, it was by, hey, that guy's paralyzed and now he's jumping for joy. Right? We don't normally see this in the West, although God can do it and does it at times. But prophecies coming to pass, things are like, there's no way, and the mockery and all that. And then it happens and you're like, whoa, how do you explain that? And again, not just the atheist or the agnostic or someone from a different religion, but a Christian who's just not thinking that way and has a small view of God. And God is saying, no, I am way bigger. Let me blow, your circuit breakers. Let me show you who I am. You thought this couldn't happen. Everybody thought this couldn't happen. Even the church fathers didn't think this could happen. And then it happened. And didn't I say it was going to happen? So what does that say about me? And maybe you want to listen to the other things I have to say. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the richness, what I find fascinating. But again, the church generally is not, they're not big fans of Bible prophecy because it's been taught badly, because it's been sensationalized, because people go way too far and extrapolate and take the prophecy and then turn it into their own theory. And it gets weird. And, some of these websites, Stephanie, I got to tell you, that are prophecy sites, they all look like they were built in Area 51 in Roswell, New Mexico, and all the sites are like in flames and all the sentences are like in capital letters with 92 exclamation points after, and so normal people, even normal believers are like, that's just weird. You people are weird. I'm not thinking about that. And pastors don't want to be identified with that. But I would say this, there's people who are preaching a false gospel out there, many versions of a false gospel. But pastors and evangelists, they don't say, well, I'm not going to preach the gospel because there are lunatics out there preaching that if you believe in Jesus and give me some money, then you'll get a Learjet and so will I. Like, that's weird, but we don't stop preaching the true gospel because there are heretics and lunatics. And yet too much of the church has abandoned outright. We're not teaching it. We're not talking about it. 27% of the scripture. It's a problem.
Mm-hmm. It is a problem. I remember co-teaching a series on Revelation, and we bent over backwards explaining that we are presenting different interpretations of scripture. We don't actually know the details of the end times, and no one can give you a schedule of how things are going to work out. But we can, God has given us a brain and a mind, and he has given us the ability to read and to make deductions like you're doing, but to do it with a lot of humility and to say, this is how we understand it. Go and seek for yourself, taste and see for yourself, come and see if this is how it is. And
well, and not only do we have a brain and an eyes and a brain and a reason, but the first chapter of Revelation comes with promises. It commands us to read it, to listen to it, and then to heed the takeaways that are, so you don't even have to understand all of Revelation, but you're supposed to read it. You're supposed to listen to it. You're supposed to try to understand it. And then the things that are clear commands and sort of so what type points, we're supposed to go heed them. We're supposed to obey them. We're supposed to do them. And we will be blessed if we do. Well, that's a pretty good thing. And yet how many people avoid not just the book of Revelation, but so many other books of prophecy? So I think that anytime we do what Thomas Jefferson did, we're in trouble. Thomas Jefferson did not believe in the Bible. He liked parts of it, but he literally took scissors and he cut out the sections that he's like, nah, that doesn't seem true. I don't like that part. This seems kind of crazy. So you had sort of the Swiss cheese version of the Bible. That is a bad idea. That is a bad idea. That's saying, God, whatever you thought when you created the world and created me in my mother's womb, and whatever you think, I'm not interested in that. I just want what I want, and the pieces that I agree with, those are good. That's a bad way. That's making us God rather than us listening to God.
Yeah, that's editing reality in so many ways. And that is such actually a symptom of today's culture. We won't go into it, but like the whole transgender thing right now, it's about editing reality to match what we want it to be as opposed to how God made us. It's just one example that comes to mind because I have teenagers at home and this is a prevalent conversation we have. So,
yeah. Well, likewise. And I'll just say on that issue, even if you step back away from just transgender, you have the American Medical Association just announced recently that they don't support putting the gender of the baby on the birth certificate.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you're like, now, wait a minute. That's just a scientific fact. It's a medical fact. But what we're heading into is just I choose not to believe that God created us in his image, male and female. He created them. And then, and what we're watching is anything goes. Then once you get rid of the basics of what God has said is true,
absolutely
anything, then you can believe in anything.
Absolutely. We're positioning ourselves as, it's terrifying because the more I get to know the depth of my own heart, the more grateful I am that I am not my own God, because it's a terrifying thought. Really, I mean, I think, I came to faith as a teenager, and I think a lot of teenagers, at least I did, we kind of think that we understand everything and we know all there is to know and we're really wise. It's part of the foolishness of teenagers, and that's okay. I was there, been there, done that. But to keep going in that idea when you are faced with life and faced with the darkness of your own heart time and time again, and to keep thinking, I can make the right choices for myself. That's a terrifying concept. I am so glad that I have learned to surrender to a Heavenly Father who knows so much more than I do what's good for me, because he understands the depth and the ugliness of my own heart way better than I do. So there's peace there, isn't there, Joel, in knowing that?
Yeah, and the sooner we come to that realization that we're actually in trouble without turning to a God who is greater than us, more powerful than us, came before us, outlives us, the better. Because one of the things that Jesus says was he warns against being the type of person who gains the whole world but forfeits his or her soul. And so if all of your life choices seem to be adding to success after success after success, money, fame, power, whatever it is that you want, and everything seems to be going your way, you'll never realize that you were incredibly successful building the ladder of success and you climb to the top. The problem is it's against the wrong house. It's against a house that's going to collapse. You didn't climb the ladder into the, to get into the house that's built on the rock and that's going to stick. And so you can be incredibly successful and then go to hell for the rest of your life of eternity with no way out. This is terrifying, but it's one of the dangers of unmitigated success, and therefore thinking that every decision you make is the exact right one. And God, in God's mercy, he often tries to show us how needy we really are. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the books I write, especially the political thrillers, but the nonfiction books too, is put characters, people who are believers, people who are unbelievers, people who are Muslims, Jews, radicals, crazies, sane, moderates, a range of realistic characters, and send them on an adventure, send them into a crisis, because you get to watch how they react and how they make mistakes and how they recover from their mistakes. And it's like you can watch someone's life compressed, and you can see and you can see people making decisions, and you know, if they're making horrible decisions, you think, why are you doing that? You see it on television. You know, it's like, you know, the teenagers that walk into the, you know, to the house where, you know, the axe murderer is in there. Well, why are you doing that? Don't run, flee. You know, why? People are cracking up their lives. Film, television, novels, literature can compress the concept of life, so you have time to watch and think, what choices am I making? And I think that's fascinating. And because some of my characters, by no means all, some go on a spiritual journey, some over a series, like over several books, they're processing, do I want to believe in Jesus? Do I even think that's a good thing, a bad thing? Some don't, and they die. And so others live and they don't make a decision, and others make that decision. It's not the center of all my books, but it's an element of some of them. And it's my way of getting people to think about things that they might not normally think about. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense at all?
It absolutely does. You're holding a mirror to all of us so that we can take a glimpse at maybe there's some deeper levels of what's inside our hearts, as opposed to keep running that race of success or whatever, however we define it. It's interesting. I know you have been asked so many times, as a Jew, how can you also be a Christian? And you talk about that a lot. And I love how your books actually are so respectfully and gently making your non-Christian audience ask themselves that question as well. So I love it, because I think it's so, again, I came to faith from atheism. And I think, if we do not put our gifts to use to draw people to ask themselves who Jesus is for themselves, then that's absolutely essential.
And now, a brief message from GospelSpice.
Has GospelSpice been a blessing to you? If so, would you partner with us and help inspire our generation to delight in God by paying GospelSpice forward? Our goal is to continue providing in-depth, high-quality, free Bible resources for all. We need your financial support to keep this going. Please pay it forward today by making a tax-deductible donation at gospelspice.com/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the video.
I want to go back. So here's the deal, Joel. I have read all of your fiction books, but they kind of all blend in my mind as one. So I couldn't name what happens in each one, because that's the problem. Joel, I have a big problem with your books, is that when I start reading them, I can't put them down. So they end up blurring because I read them back to back, and then I'm exhausted because I haven't slept in 3 days. It's terrible. And so I really don't remember what happens in which, but I do remember just the general outline that you have. And then
well, I like to hear that, having read so many or all of my books, that you are having me on your podcast anyway. That's very good. I could have been like, yeah, that's the last guy I want on the program.
I think one of your many spiritual gifts is storytelling. You are a phenomenal storyteller. Jesus was a phenomenal storyteller. So I think it's one of the most beautiful spiritual gifts we can have is storytelling. And you definitely have that. So you honor your Lord when you...
I don't know if it's a spiritual gift, because it's not defined in the scriptures.
That's okay.
But I think I think it's definitely a gift that God gives us. But there are great storytellers, but certainly better than me that they don't know the Lord, right? I mean, Hollywood is filled with great storytellers. There's the musical field is filled with people who can tell a great story in 3 minutes, and they don't know the Lord though. But I appreciate that, and I hope that I'm using what the combination of spiritual giftings and natural giftings, but certainly blessings from the Lord, using them for His purposes. And I think one of the things I will just say is, most people don't actually want to be educated. They want to be entertained. That's not necessarily the greatest part of our era, but it's true. People would much prefer to binge watch Netflix or Amazon Prime than to pick up the newspaper or, watch a documentary or, whatever. And so we can rail against the entertainment culture, or we can try to use it. And in my case, I'm thinking, all right, as a thriller writer, my number one objective is not to preach the gospel or teach prophecy or teach the Bible or share my faith. No, my number one objective is to thrill. I need to keep Stephanie up all night long with my short little pages that are short little chapters that are sort of like Pringles potato chips. You can't eat just one, and you're hooked and you're being pulled in, and you're thinking, well, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I gotta go to bed. I've got a husband. I got these teenagers, but I just want to know this chapter's short. I'll just do one more, and then it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and you're cursing me. You're nice. You're sweet. But you're like, oh, bless your heart. But I know what you mean. But people like you and people like you, but if I've kept you up much of the night or all the night, and you're like, I got to go to work. I got to help the kids. I got to do this. Then I'm doing my job, and then I have the right to try to do other things too. And I would joke that, again, if you're doing entertainment, so we had some neighbors a few years back, her kids wouldn't eat any protein, and they just could. She was like, how am I going to get them to have more protein in their diet? So she would make smoothies for the kids, like banana, strawberry smoothies, but she would sneak in some meatloaf and she'd whip it into the thing. I know, but they never noticed it. And we were like, oh, that's disgusting. She goes, I know, but I made it so that you couldn't taste that. But I just had to get some protein into them. And I've used that analogy over the years to say, well, that's kind of what I'm doing with these novels. There's an educational component about what's going on in the Middle East or the nature of evil or whatever. And there's a spiritual dynamic. There's a number of things going on. But I have to put the meatloaf in the smoothie because people don't want to eat the meatloaf. They want a smoothie, and they don't even want to know there's meatloaf in there because that would then even be disgusting. Mm-hmm. So I probably shouldn't even tell you this. But just between you and me, that's what I'm doing.
Usually it's the other way around. We're trying to put veggies in our kids' meals, not.
Well, okay, whatever. Yeah.
Actually, isn't that interesting? Because you see, I think the secret to any smoothie that is trying to hide meatloaf is the right blend of spices. Because if you have the right spices, it's going to cover up anything that you don't really want to show. That actually takes us to an interesting thing that I think that happened exactly in one of your books. I think it's your latest. And again, like I said, I can't remember which it is.
I'd like you to be able to remember the latest book, remember some of it.
So it's the one where you have someone who is not a character, who's actual person, the King of Jordan, who has his helicopter and rescues basically his palace that gets attacked. And as a result of writing about this non-fictional character having fictional events happening to his kingdom and his family, something pretty incredible happened. He read it, and then something crazy happened. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think it just tickled me to no end that your fiction books led you to meet a king.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I wrote a trilogy of novels. Actually, it was several years ago, but the King of Jordan, I made him an actual character because he in real life, he's so interesting that I thought, well, how do you make a fictional character more interesting than the real guy? He's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He's the 43rd generation descendant. He was a special forces commando. He was the commander of all special forces in Jordan. He never intended to be the king. Nobody ever wanted him to be the king. The king himself, his father, King Hussein, had appointed his Abdullah's uncle to be the crown prince. So this was never a thing that he was going to become the king. And then 3 days before King Hussein died of cancer, he changed the plan of succession, and Abdullah, his oldest son, became the crown prince. And 3 days later, the king died and he became king. So this guy is just super interesting, and he's a moderate, and he likes Christians, and what is going on there? So I made him a character. And then I tried to have, and then in the fictional plot, ISIS is trying to destroy his palace, assassinate him and his family, and take over the kingdom of Jordan and fly the black flags of ISIS over Amman. So, it turns out one of his advisors read the book, the second in the series, then gave the copy that he just read, he gave it to the king. He said, "Your Majesty, you have to read this." He said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're in it." He said, "What do you mean I'm in it? It's a novel." He said, "I know, but you're a character in the book." What? And so he took 2 days, and the king read the book.
See?
And then he said, who is this guy? What's that?
Me too. He lost sleep over it. I'm telling you, you're guilty of major crimes.
Well, think of how interesting to read any book that you enjoy, but then if you're in it and you think, what happens to me? What happens to my wife, my children? Is he going to kill us? Who is this person? Oh my gosh. And then, rather than banning me from his kingdom forever, which he has every right to do, he invited my wife and me to come for 5 days to Jordan, all expenses paid, to get to know him and his advisors. And it was fascinating. In fact, the first day we got there, we were driven to the palace and we had lunch with him. It was just him, the advisor that had given him the book, and Lynn and myself.
That's crazy.
And we sat down and he says, "Joel, I was wondering where it would be fun to meet you for the first time." And I thought, well, you did blow up my palace. So I thought I should bring you to this palace and have you look at it and go, maybe we shouldn't do that. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, so it's lovely. I really, really don't want this to happen. I said, I'm not predicting it will happen. I'm writing a worst case scenario. Because I know. He said, but you made me a character, but you turned my advisors and my staff into fictional people. But I can see who's who. So I buy copies of the book, and I give them to my staff, and I say, "Here's you on page 57. You don't make it through the terrorist attack. You better go read this." And it was so funny. It was like he's got a sense of humor about it. We really had such a fascinating time with him, and that was the first of 5 meetings with him over time. And he asked me to bring a delegation of evangelical Christian leaders to meet with him, and one other thing. So he had read the second in the series. So I had brought him copies of the first book, and I said, "Your Majesty, I brought you some copies for you and your team. And can I just show you one, like the first sentence of the first page is I think you'll find it interesting." Like, sure. So I opened it up and I said, the first sentence of the series reads, "I had never met a king before." And he laughed and he pulls out a pen. He goes, "Well, you have now." And he signed it and he gave it back to us. And we still have that. So he's got a great sense of humor. He's a fascinating man. He's the longest serving monarch or leader of any kind in the Middle East. And, we don't agree on everything. He's a Muslim. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. But we don't agree on everything politically. But I really have a deep respect for how tough he is against radicals, how kind he is to the Christians in his kingdom. He's maintaining a peace treaty with Israel. There's a lot there. But now he's read the whole series, and now my new book, Enemies and Allies, tells this story and tells more about him and why he's so significant. And, very few, it was amazing that Lynn and I got an opportunity like that. But obviously, most people, certainly most Christians, are never going to get a chance to meet a king or spend, not just meet, shake a hand, get a photo op. No, hours and hours and hours and multiple meetings. So this book, Enemies and Allies, I take you into the motorcade. I put you on the plane with me. We go, I take you into Jordan, into the palace, and you sit down with the king, and not just that king, but the president of Egypt and the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. There are multiple books written about the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, probably the most controversial leader in the Middle East on the ally side. But none of these writers have ever met him, much less talked to him for hours on the record. This is the first book that does that. And we even ask him things like, Your Royal Highness, you don't allow a single church to operate in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We just came from the United Arab Emirates. They have 700 churches freely operating. Can we talk about that? Will you build a church? And I'm not going to give you the answer, but it's on the record and it's in the book. But imagine a chance to have that opportunity, Stephan. You lived for a while in the Middle East. You know that, and you lived in a kingdom. So you know that this is not normal. And not just to meet a leader, but to be invited to ask the hardest, most sensitive questions. It was fascinating, and we decided we should tell this story, and that's what Enemies and Allies. We do look at the enemies. I didn't get invited by the supreme leader of Iran to sit down.
I'm glad you didn't.
I might have. I mean, in theory, Stephanie, maybe they would have let me in. I'm just not sure they would have let me out.
No, don't go.
But with most of the rest of the leaders in the region, you sit down and you meet them. You may not agree with them. You may love them. You may hate them. You may, I don't know, but you hear them in their own words answering all of our questions.
Yeah, I think that's what Enemies and Allies does, is that what you just said, everything about King Abdullah, it's all in the book. It's in that chapter that I had the privilege to read. And you do this with all of these characters. And so what you do is that you demystify, for us who don't meet them and don't really know who they are, you demystify all of the things we can hear maybe in the media. And I think you really are a tour guide into the Middle East today. And that's precious because trusted tour guides are rare. The problem with the tour guide is that if we believe what they say and they end up trying to manipulate us, it's very dangerous. And what I appreciate about you is that you give extremely honest feedback. It's your own personal experience, backed up with a lifetime of you being a political expert and understanding how the Middle East functions. And so you are a unique voice in that sense. I want us to switch gears a little bit as we're beginning to wrap up here. Just like you bring your political and Jewish cultural expertise to your analysis of the events in the Middle East, past, present, and your interpretation of what things could be potentially in the future based on your analysis of prophecy, can you bring it all home for us, regular Christians who are seeking to honor the Lord and are seeking to taste scripture through the flavor grid of the Jewish culture? Can you, if you could sit down with someone you've got 5 minutes with someone who wants to glorify the Lord and go deeper in his or her relationship with the Lord through an understanding of the Jewish culture, what do you tell them in 5 minutes? Going, maybe some of the things that spoke to you the most, the things that have blown your mind the most about the Jewish culture when it comes to God and Jesus, maybe in particular.
Sure. Well, I would say two major points, and then you can pull on the threads for more details if you want. But the first is what I mentioned before. I think most Christians have not really come to understand how exciting and rich and intriguing the material in the Bible is from the Hebrew prophets and from the apostles as well when they speak about prophecy, right? But specifically the Hebrew prophets from the Old Testament. There is so much richness. There's so much we learn about who God is, how he works, what he's going to do in the future, what he has done in the past. I just think it is really it is not a complete meal if a chef, a Michelin rated, world-class French chef makes you a 7-course meal and you're like, yeah, 2 of those courses I'm not doing. There's a plan and there's a pattern, and people can do it. But I'm saying if the God of the universe cooks you a 7-course meal and you decide I'm not doing 27% of your meal, I don't care. That's a problem. It's not just about the taste; it's about the nutrition. It's about the value to your to your soul. So that's one thing that I think is really missing. But let me put it on the negative side. There's a risk there are some Christians who don't understand how much God loves Israel and the Jewish people. And I think that's part of the Hebrew prophets is we are a very sinful people. We're a stiff-necked people. That's how the Bible describes us, but God loves us and he's doing things and we're a model. The New Testament talks about look to Israel, good, bad, or ugly. We learn a lot about God and about ourselves when we look at the nation of Israel. So don't avoid it. That's the one side, but the flip side is I'm concerned, Stephanie, that there are a number of Christians in the world who have come to idealize Israel and the Jewish people. I'm happy that they get excited that Israel exists and that God does love the Jewish people, but they elevate Jewishness and what the ancient rabbis or current modern rabbis teach. And, you can't really understand the Bible unless you understand rabbinic thinking, and unless you understand the oral law and what the ancient rabbis and what the modern rabbis say. You can't really understand how sweet and rich the Bible is. Jesus specifically warns against the leaven or the yeast of the Pharisees, right? If the Jewish rabbis had gotten it right, the Jewish people would be following their Messiah, our Messiah. They didn't get it right. Now, it's not to say that they didn't get it right on some things, right? So, but Jesus warns, don't get all caught up into the way the Pharisees teach, because unless your righteousness is more than theirs, you're not getting into the kingdom of heaven. And he says they put so many burdens and they misunderstand. Jesus says to the Pharisees, you don't understand the power of Scripture. You don't get it. It's sad, but I know, unfortunately, too many Christians who've gotten in their excitement about Israel and the Jewish people have somehow elevated Jewish religion and the rabbis who teach it, past, present, and past and present, as like that's the pinnacle. And I'm sorry, it's not. Mm-hmm. It's not. These are most of these rabbis and Pharisees. I mean, almost all of them have not understood or have purposely misled our people. And so don't go there. So I don't want, there is richness in the Bible, but there's danger. There's poison in the rabbis and the prophet and the Pharisees. And you remember the story in the Old Testament where a bunch of the sons of the prophets decide to make some stew, and they go out and they just gather stuff and they throw it in the pot. And then they realize, there's poison in the pot. And then I think it was to Elisha, They're like, help, and he has to do a miracle and handle it. And I would just say that there are people who are teaching out there. They mean well, but they're not using discernment. Because they've elevated somewhere in themselves, the Jewish leaders, they really know. And I wish that were true. I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm a Semite.
Yes.
But I'm opposed to false teachers. And unfortunately, too many in the Jewish world, they either don't understand or they're purposely against Jesus and his followers. And so that's a little longer than you probably wanted, but it's there are good spices, but if you put the wrong thing in the stew, you're going to die.
Exactly. There's very toxic spices as well, or too much of a good spice can also become toxic. So same thing. Yeah. If you ingest too much cinnamon, it actually kills you. But who really wants to literally ingest, pounds of cinnamon? But
and it has an effect on our relationships. If your Arab friends or your Persian friends always hearing, Israel does everything it does is right, when we know is not everything Israel does is right, but we have a right to exist, to be safe, to be sovereign, to be free. But if our understanding of the Bible and the gospel story is out of balance, you're gonna harm and hurt people who love Jesus but don't see it and are put off by it. And you might keep away someone who might come to faith from an Arab ethnicity or an Islamic religious background, who for them Israel is a stumbling block. There are enough stumbling blocks in Islam or the Middle East. Israel doesn't need to be the next one. And I will say just on that, just that, I have many Arab Christian friends all throughout the region. They don't believe, they don't want war with Israel. They don't support jihad or, anything. But to be honest, they don't believe that current Israel has anything to do with Bible prophecy. And that whole discussion is not a conversation they want to have. In my friends in Egypt and Jordan and Iraq. And the funny thing is that, and you probably know this better than most, Stephanie, Muslims who leave Islam and come to faith in Jesus tend to be much more excited about reading the Bible going, oh, Israel's a good thing. Jews are a good thing, because everything that they were taught in Islam, they're pretty much saying that's probably wrong. Let me start fresh. But Arab Christians who grew up in Israel's terrible, Zionism is bad, it's racist, Jews are bad, they don't necessarily look at the Bible from a fresh start and say, yeah, Israel makes a lot of mistakes, but God seems to still love them and have a plan for them. So anyway, that's a thing.
It absolutely is. I completely agree. I had a conversation not very long ago with someone who I'm hoping will be on the podcast soon, who is one of the leading Arab Christians in the Middle East. And she was telling me how fed up she is with Israel always being the answer to everything. And as an Arab Christian, she really struggles with that. And my husband, as an Arab Christian coming from Islam, has a very different perspective and is actually in the process of trying to learn Hebrew. And he has that very balanced view. He just dreams. Having Arabic as a native tongue really helps with Hebrew. I can only try to, I use Hebrew a lot, but I can't read it for the life of me. But I use it in Bible studies and stuff. So it's fascinating to hear all of the different perspectives. It actually reminds me when I came to faith, oddly enough, for some reason, the very first book I studied on my own, my very first Bible study was the book of Daniel. Isn't that an interesting choice? I don't remember why I chose that, but it makes me think of this because Daniel had an understanding of the scriptures of Isaiah that just helped him understand some of the things that were going to happen. And so it's just really interesting to read that.
Right. We're in Daniel 9. We see him. He's actually sitting in the scrolls of Jeremiah going, hey, I think this is going to happen. Wow. Exactly. I mean, that guy himself was a prophet and he was studying the prophets.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yes. Choose your sources well.
Yeah. And I just want one other thing on that about the relationship with our Arab brothers and sisters. There are some friends of mine who really are trying to convince their Arab Christian friends that Israel is biblically prophetic and it's a thing, it's important. And I don't feel the need to do it, honestly, Stephanie. In the grand scheme, Arab Christians have many challenges. And I'd rather connect on Romans 1:16, that the gospel is the power of salvation, the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. Jews first, yes, but everybody else as well. I'd rather connect on the gospel, the point of unity, than try to persuade an Arab Christian, because if God wants to adjust that view, wonderful. I'm all for it. I'm happy to have the conversation, but I don't feel the need to drive that. And I feel like some of my friends feel that need, and I think that's a mistake. And I would say it's also true in the Reformed world versus the dispensational world, or you have, people who are very, very pro-Israel and people who are it's not a thing. And I think in the grand scheme, God has made Israel a country again. If most of the church didn't get it when it happened, most of the church still doesn't get it now. But it's not stopping God. Nothing can thwart God's will. We read in Job 42. So I'm reaching out to my Reformed world brothers and sisters. But if I had to make a choice between persuading them that current Israel is biblically prophetic or significant, that's not my main objective. My main objective is, hey, you guys pretty much avoid the topic of Israel and the Jews. but could you go preach Romans 1:16 more? Because you have great influence over many millions of Christians. And if you don't tell people that Jewish evangelism is important, how are they going to know that it is? Because just like Romans 10 talks about, we think about in terms of the gospel, how will they believe unless they've heard? Well, how will they hear unless somebody tells them? How will somebody tell them unless they're sent? That whole story. That's not just true about unsaved people hearing the gospel. It's also true about the church. If you don't teach people to go share the gospel with Muslims and love them and not just force it down their throat, or with Jews, or with anybody, then a lot of people just don't think about that. After 9/11, right, 20 years ago, most Christians weren't thinking, you know what? Do we need to go tell more Muslims about Jesus, and then they'll come to faith and it'll transform their hearts and this will be great. They're like, let's go nuke them. Let's burn down their countries. Like, there was such anger. That's understandable, but it's not biblical. And so it's taken a long time. I think the church is better in the West about understanding that Muslims can come to faith, are coming to faith, and we need to support ministries that help that happen and strengthen our brothers and sisters and plant lots of seeds. But it's taken time. So we need to teach people to love Muslims and teach people to love Jews, because it doesn't come naturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
You're right. As we're wrapping up, I want you to, in light of this, everything you just said about building bridges as opposed to burning them for the wrong reasons, can you give us a very quick analysis and just a 5-minute version of the meaning of the Abraham Accords? Because it has to do with building bridges. How can the church step into that? How are we to understand this? What does it mean for us today?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephanie. And it's interesting that the Abraham Accords are just factually, they are a series of peace and normalization agreements between Arab countries and Israel. The first peace treaties between Israel and any Arab country in more than a quarter of a century, right? So you'd have to go back to 1994, Israel's peace treaty with the Kingdom of Jordan. And before that was 1979. That was the first ever Egypt and Israel. So, wow, we had two over, 50 years roughly, and then four just in 2020. United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Morocco was coming back to a relationship that had been warmer, but because of some wars and other tensions, political tensions, they had pulled away. So, but the point is, this is a breakthrough. This is, and I talk about this in the book because I was sitting with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates in 2018 with this evangelical delegation in the palace for 2 hours. And one of the things I said to him is, Your Royal Highness, Christians pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but we've been praying for a long time and we haven't seen anybody make peace with Israel in almost 25 years. We're looking who will be the next Arab leader to do it. And Mohammed bin Zayed, we call him MBZ in the region, he leaned forward and he said, Joel, it's going to be me. I'm ready to make peace. And we were like, whoa. That was news, except that the conversation at the time was off the record. We couldn't tell anyone. But he spent time explaining why he'd gotten to that point and the path forward. And sure enough, in August of 2020, they made the announcement, August 13th. And then I was at the White House on September 15th, 2020, covering it for our all Arab News and all Israel News websites, the actual signing. So interesting. So the good news is, attitudes towards Israel are changing dramatically. These are tectonic changes in the Middle East. The Arab states, one after another, are concluding, you know what? We love the Palestinians and we want their lives to be better. And the Arab states support a Palestinian state, a sovereign state. But Arab leaders are increasingly very, very frustrated that the Palestinian leadership seems to say no to every peace initiative that has been brought up for the last 75 years. And they're like, come on, guys. We're willing to invest $50 billion to create Palestinian jobs and wealth and security, but you guys have to come to the table and say yes to something. You're not going to get all that you want, but the more time that goes by, Israel gets stronger and they have less need to make peace with you at all. Get with the program, but we're not going to wait anymore. The United Arab Emirates decided we're not going to wait. We support peace with the Palestinians in Israel, but we're not going to wait anymore. It's been 75 years. We're not doing it anymore. Bahrain decided, Sudan decided, Morocco decided. And I think others are coming. And I describe in great detail in the book that I think there are more Arab countries that are going to make peace. And I think Saudi Arabia is one of them. And I think that's going to be the mother of all peace treaties. I wrote a political thriller called The Jerusalem Assassin about a possible pathway to a Saudi-Israeli thing. That's peace deal. That's fiction for right now. In the book, I describe why I think we're heading in that direction. The last point about that, you asked about how Christians should understand it and how we should be part of it. Let me first say it's interesting that these leaders they chose the term Abraham Accords. And I think that's fascinating. Why did they do it? They did it because Abraham is beloved in all three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham is all considered the patriarch. What's interesting is these Arab Muslim leaders have not clearly thought through the fact that God promised to Abraham the very land of Israel, all of it, far more than we currently have. I don't think that's the intention of these leaders. I haven't brought it up as the main point at this point. We're just happy. Let's just focus on on peace. That's good. I'm not trying to create a new problem, but it's interesting. But I will also say that, remember, Abraham had tension with Lot. And they decided, you know what, the best thing to do is not to keep fighting with each other. Let's separate. You take this portion of land, Lot, and Abraham said, I'll take the rest. Now, Abraham was promised all of it. But whether it was right or not, I'm not sure, but that was Abraham's way. Let's just separate. And that is a possible route forward for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? I don't believe that Israel is going to get all the land that was promised to Abraham and to the various prophets until the millennial kingdom. So it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen now. And Israel already doesn't have Gaza. Gaza is part of the land grant given to Israel, but Israel doesn't want it right now. And, parts of Lebanon and parts of Syria, Jordan, half of Jordan is supposed to be Israel. Actually, all of Jordan, but
I'm not sure King Abdullah would agree.
And into Iraq, right? That's just going to start a new conflict. So here's the point. It's important to understand that many Christians have been praying for the peace of Jerusalem, just as we're commanded in Psalm 122, verse 6. And wow, God is a prayer hearing and a prayer answering God. And we should be grateful. Wow, that's exciting. That's encouraging. That's number one. Number two, we need to pray that this circle of peace and moderation and cooperation expands. Three, that as peace and normalization expands, with it tourism, trade, technology transfers, other things, military cooperation, that conditions get easier for Christians, that there's more religious freedom, that the Saudis say, yes, the Christians, there's 1.4 million Christian workers and their families living in Saudi Arabia. They should be able to open up churches, right? So we want more religious freedom in the region and the opportunity to preach the gospel with all the spices. And so that's what we want. And we should be praying towards that end. And one of the things I do, both with All Israel News, All Arab News, but also with our ministry, the Joshua Fund, that funds these ministries, strengthens the Christians in the region, strengthens the Bible colleges and the pastors and all these things. We need to do it financially. We need to do it prayerfully. We need to do it relationally. We need to do it educationally. And then this book, Enemies and Allies, again, helps to educate people all around the world, Christian or not, what's happening and how do we pray and how do we understand. A lot's been happening in recent years, but most Americans and Canadians and others, we've been focused on COVID and on the economy and on race riots and on closed churches and on vaccines. And on contentious political debates, we haven't been paying attention to big changes going on in the region. So hopefully this book will be a chance for people to catch up and realize, wow, some big things are happening. The last thing I would say on that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons these Arab countries are making peace with Israel is they realize that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. U.S. withdrew all its forces under the Obama-Biden administration from Iraq, and now we see it in Afghanistan. Now, whether you agree with it or not, the people and the leaders of the Middle East are terrified that the world's only superpower is saying, yeah, we're done with you all. And that's the way it feels. And I think it's true, mostly. And they are thinking Iran is becoming a nuclear armed power. They're not quite there yet, but they're getting close. And they are vowing to destroy us or take us over. So how do we work together to defend ourselves against these enemies? How do we become allies, Arab and Israeli, against Iranian enemies? And Iran is teaming up with Russia and North Korea and China and even Turkey and Qatar. It's getting complicated. And so people are thinking, who can I turn to? And the Arabs are looking to Israel and they're saying, you know what? We've always thought they're the enemy. But actually, I think they're the ally. They are trying to make peace with the Palestinians, and they have the strongest Air Force, strongest Navy, strongest army. They have the best technology, the best intelligence. And if we had to go to war with Iran, we don't want to, but if we had to, who could we trust? The United States? They're not sure. Israel? They're becoming more and more sure. So that's a dynamic that we also need to understand. That's the short version. The longer version is called Enemies and Allies. On sale now in hardcover, ebook, and audio.
Absolutely. And it's one of those books that reads like a political thriller, except it's all reality. And this is where sometimes reality is even so crazy that you don't need fiction, because your book really just gives us a good glimpse into what reality looks like today. Actually, it's when I read a really good book, I have this pillow that my husband gave me, and it says on it, just one more chapter. It literally says that. And I have that pillow, like I literally use it as a sign when I cannot be bothered. And I think Enemies and Allies will force me to pull out that pillow again. I am not grateful to you for that, for another all-nighter that you're going to force me to do soon. Can you tell us if we want?
Well, again, with this type of topic, I think most Christians, most Americans, others, they know this issue of the Middle East is important, but it sometimes it's so complicated, and they think, I don't want to read a bunch of dry history and quotes and this, and I can't get my head around it. And what I hope to do is make the story I chose. I hope it's the right choice. I chose to make it personal. Come with me. I'm going to take you into the palace. You're going to meet this crown prince. You're going to meet this king. I'm going to take you in to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu. You're going to hear in his own words and their own words and her own words, what do they believe? You may agree with it. You may disagree with it. But I think when you finish this book, or not even read it, just download it to your phone and let someone read it to you. It's an audio book. And you go, I think it's like a 5,000 word puzzle. And you're like, I don't do puzzles. But you have to start by framing the outsides. And this book will help you frame the current moment. Because if you read a book from 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, things have changed so much. That stuff is true, but it's also changed. This book is the only book right now that has gone into any of this, including how did the Abraham Accords happen and what do they mean, and how particularly how should Christians view it, but it's not a book just for Christians. So I do hope it's helpful for people, especially at the 20th anniversary of 9/11, where we all sort of know this is a moment we ought to take stock. Where are we with this thing? And of course, as the president has made some, I think, mistaken, very dangerous decisions to just abandon and surrender in Afghanistan, and the Taliban terrorists have taken over the country we spent 20 years liberating, it reopens the question, who are our enemies? Who are our allies? And what's our responsibilities in dealing with both?
Mm-hmm. The timing, once again, of your book is absolutely perfect. you are a trusted tour guide, especially for Christians to understand the Middle East today. And so that makes Enemies and Allies absolutely a must read this season to enter into the Middle East through you. Actually, if for people who want to go deeper or maybe daily, can you briefly tell us about All Arab News, All Israel News, how we can start hearing from you every day and to decipher the Middle East?
Sure. So we set up 2 websites on September 1st, 2020. And within days, I was on a flight to Washington to go to the White House to cover the signing of the Abraham Accords. And boy, we've had a rocket war between Gaza and Israel, 4,500 rockets. We've had 4 peace treaties. We've had an Israeli an election. We have the end of the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel, Netanyahu. Now he's gone. Somebody that nobody knows is now the prime minister. People are trying to figure out who he is. There's been a lot to cover. And we've had the Pope visiting Iraq. We've had devastation and explosions and poverty in Lebanon. And of course, the rise of Iran's nuclear force and the end of the Trump years and the rise of Biden. Lots to cover. So we have these 2 sites, and they are the daily coverage. All Israel News, which you can find at allisrael.com. Again, allisrael.com. And then our sister site, which is linked to it, is All Arab News. And that's allarab.news, allarab.news. But they're cross-linked. So some stories are on, not all of them, obviously, but it's almost like 2 sections of the newspaper. And why do we have both? Because I believe God loves Israel and her neighbors. And I know that a lot of Arab Christians, and certainly Arab Muslims, at the highest levels, at the clerical level, at the academic level, they're just not ready or willing to be interviewed, quoted, cited, profiled on a news site called All Israel News. Forget it. It's not going to happen. So we created a different site, and we have Arabs who are on our advisory council. We have some of the most prominent Arab Muslims in the region. We have Arab Christians who advise us. And I am almost as more excited about that site than All Israel, but I can't really say that. But I just say that because as a Jewish person and an Israeli citizen, all these doors opening to me and to our team into the Arab world is fascinating. Just in the last year, I've been invited to go to Bahrain and meet the most senior leaders, not quite the king yet, but the diplomatic advisor to the king, the foreign minister, the minister of trade and industry. I'd never been to Bahrain before. Now I have, because of All Arab News. Multiple trips into the United Arab Emirates. Yes, I'd met the crown prince, but that was before the Abraham Accords were signed. Now I've been there twice to cover what's happening. And I've met with the foreign minister, and I've met with all these different range of leaders. So it's super interesting for us on the day-to-day level. I will just say this as to wrap up. We cover the breaking news and the main events of the day. We have exclusive interviews that we do. We also link to the best and most credible coverage about the region and in the region. So we want to be your one-stop shop. If you want to do what we do, which is read 20 or 30 websites every day and other sources, great. But if you just come to our sites, you're going to see not only the original stories and analysis, not just what's happening, why does it matter, and what does it mean? So that's the value added we provide. But you'll also see links to all the most interesting stories of the day. Even if you don't have to read them all. If you just skim them, you'll have a clear sense of what's happening. And then we provide stories about Christians in the region and Christian conferences and stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else. We wish you did, but the reason we're doing this is the site is not only for evangelical Christians or Christians in general, but it's primarily, it's what are Christians doing? How do Christians see these events? Mm-hmm. And we're watching Jews and Muslims and others tracking our stories because they're curious. What do Christians think about what's going on in our region? Last thing I'll say is we do, for both sites, we have a free email that you can sign up for. And that way, sometimes it's just 2 times a week, sometimes it's 3. If if it's a war, you'll probably get an email every single day, but it has the top 5, 6, 7 stories of that day. So you don't even have to come to the site necessarily. It'll come to you. You can just skim it. You can click on what you're interested in, and it'll help you know a little bit better how to pray, and certainly what's happening. The book gives you the big picture, the context, and the websites give you the day-to-day dynamic.
Yes, I have yet to not click on one of your links whenever I receive one of those. There's always something that grabs my attention, and I'm always going there. So absolutely.
Well, you're also
highly
welcome
recommend
to write for us. If you or your husband ever were interested in writing a column, an occasional, don't.
Maybe my husband could. I don't feel I could do that, but
well, you're doing this. That's not that far away from interviewing people. Turn an interview into an article.
Mm-hmm.
Not a sermon.
I just interviewed Joel Rosenberg. Maybe I can write something about that.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. Just a shameless plug for just a second. If you joined us listening to Joel and you're new to the GospelSpice podcast, next week we have Rebecca Bender, who will be telling us about the fight against human trafficking, which is the other passion that we have here at GospelSpice Ministries. And in 2 weeks, we are diving deep in the Jewish culture with a brand new Bible study where we are experiencing the tabernacle to discover Christ in fresh new ways. And actually, it's kind of like all Arab and all Israel news. We have been pooling dozens and dozens of sources and commentaries from all sorts of backgrounds to bring you what we feel is an absolutely compelling and irresistible glimpse at our precious Lord and Savior. That starts in 2 weeks, and that is our tabernacle study. So Joel Rosenberg, thank you so much, my goodness, for all the time you've given us today. What a treasure, and I hope we can do that again sometime.
I would enjoy that, Stephanie. Thank you for being interested.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the GospelSpice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of GospelSpice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.